Okay, so that video does a pretty good job of talking about, just generally sort of testosterone and things like that. And it introduced a concept that I wanted to expand on a little bit, the 2D, 4D ratio. I've done a lot of research involving the 2D, 4D ratio, and it predicts a lot of things having to do with sexual decision making and other kinds of things. So they briefly showed it in the video, and you might be curious about your own 2D, 4D ratio. The first thing I'll tell you from the things I've read and my own personal research is that you want to focus on your dominant hand. So whichever hand you predominantly use, measure it. And what you want to do is measure from the crease to the tip of your index finger and from the crease to the tip of your ring finger and see which one's longer. Now, these people in these pictures, they don't even have to measure. You can clearly tell that the person on the left has a longer ring finger, and you can clearly tell that the person on the right has a longer index finger. But some of us have fingers that are much closer in length, and so it's really important to go ahead and actually measure those. Everybody in my family has fingers that look visibly like they're the same length. And then when I measure them, I see that there's like 1 millimeter difference or 2 millimeters difference. So it's worthwhile to measure. If you think they look the same length, for sure, you should measure them. Anyway, on average, straight men tend to have the pattern on the left and straight women tend to have the pattern on the right. Whereas that is flipped among lesbians whose pattern looks more like straight men, and among gays whose pattern looks more like straight women. Now, what that indicates is that possibly there has been a flipping of the hormone exposure prenatally. It's important to note that the hands, if you guys remember your proximodistal and your cephalocaudal development, it came back in adolescence, even though I promised you we would leave it in adolescence. Because our brains develop ahead of our hands, and then our brains continue to develop well beyond after our hands are done forming. It's possible that you could have your hands look one way, but your brain is still organized the other way. But what we're finding is a lot of things that are like sex differences between males and females in the way that they make judgments or decisions correspond better to their hand ratio than it does to even just their actual sex. So it's really something important to consider. But the fact that hand ratio can predict sexual orientation indicates that prenatal hormone exposure may play a really strong role. The last thing I'll say with regard to hands is do not use your hand ratio to decide whether you are gay or straight. That is not a good policy. Go with, who do you fantasize about, or, who do you feel the most aroused by, or think about that. That should be deciding your sexual orientation. But I wanted to make sure that we flowed directly from prenatal hormones into brain structures because we think that prenatal hormones probably shape the brain. So here's a picture of the brain. It's a nice cross section. So we're just looking at the right hemisphere right now in this picture. And then we've got this blue line that's kind of cutting it, perpendicularly now. And now we're looking at that straight on in the picture down below. In the area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which we've talked about before in our biological development chapter when I talked about it being the thing that triggers puberty to start. I told you that the hypothalamus has a lot to do with sexual behavior, and one of the things that the hypothalamus we think does is determine which sex you're oriented towards. There's a little area, and they conveniently colored it purple in this picture, but it is not colored purple in real life. It's called INAH3 for interstitial nucleus anterior hypothalamus third region. This particular area in all different species that have been measured, including humans, is larger in males than it is in females. And by larger, I mean it actually is larger in diameter and it's more densely packed with neurons. So we have this area that tends to be bigger in males than in females. So that got some people to start wondering what it does. One hypothesis was that it might help to determine which sex we're oriented towards. So back in the early 90s, a researcher used bodies that were donated to science, which a lot of times that means that they died on the street. And he dissected this particular part of their brains, and he looked to see whether there was a difference in the size of this INAH3 area among the men in the study who were known to be gay versus those who were known to be heterosexual. And he found that the heterosexual males region was much larger than the gay males. And in fact, theirs looked more similar to straight females' brains, and in this one little area. And so this researcher, his name was Simon LeVay, reported this, and some people thought, awesome, you found evidence for biological differences that might help to explain sexual orientation. Other people said, because Simon LeVay was gay, that he was just trying to find an excuse for why some people are gay and, make it seem like it was, normal or something, was what they were arguing. His sexual orientation had nothing to do with the data, but they attacked him. It's what's called an ad hominem attack. They just attacked him as a person because they didn't like what his research found. Well, the good news is over time, MRIs became more and more affordable for psychologists and researchers to use. And so they did follow-up studies with live people. So now we could ask follow-up questions to find out about, their sexual orientation and, whether they've ever engaged in these sexual acts and all these different things that would answer some of the criticisms that people had had of Simon LeVay's original research. And through that kind of MRI study, what we now know unequivocally is that the INAH3 of straight men and lesbians look very similar, and gay men and heterosexual women look very similar. So it looks like if you have a big INAH3, you're attracted to women, and if you have a small INAH3, you're attracted to men. Now, it's not 100% perfect, and there's a bunch of psychological stuff that goes into sexual attraction and other kinds of things. But on average, this appears to be the pattern, and this explains maybe a connection between prenatal hormone exposure and then how the brain developed that in this particular area that is so critical to determining sexual attraction. So I think what I'm going to leave you with is just sort of this statement that most of the evidence is pointing towards sexual orientation being biologically determined. That if a person's attracted to the other sex, it's probably due to some combination of genes and hormones and brain structures, and less likely to be due to things that, for example, Sigmund Freud argued, that, the absence of a parent, the absence of a father will determine that a boy will become gay or something like that. Like those theories have basically not been supported. With a lot of people have studied them, and there's so much evidence on the side of biology and so little evidence on the side of social constructs that I'm just going to very confidently end the sexual orientation part by just saying it looks like it's biologically determined. Now, something I just wanted to throw in there for your reading pleasure, because I think a lot of people have an incorrect impression about the olden days and how much more free people are today and things like that. The sexual revolution, we had one that was present in the 20s. I mentioned it before, where women stopped wearing corsets, and with the, onset of cars, where people could then, have a little modicum of privacy and things. There was this big influx of unwed parenthood and a whole bunch of stuff that came along with that. It was also that during that time of, the 1920s, when there was a big push for birth control. It had been illegal to use birth control up until then, and at least certain things were no longer criminalized to be able to try and plan your family and things like that. So, and then we had a return to the sexual revolution really in the 1960s and through the 70s. So this has come in, fluctuations where we have times when things really move forward and then times where it sort of pulls back a little. I just wanted to make it really clear to you that, like, for the past 100 years, the United States has been going through a sexual revolution. All right. Enough on sex. Let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll come back and I'll wrap up this chapter. We'll start the wrap up with the relationship with parents.